Welcome to Legends Lore for Sleep. I'm so glad you found your way here tonight. This channel is your sanctuary for deep relaxation and epic storytelling. A place where ancient myths, legendary heroes, and captivating narratives meet the peaceful embrace of sleep. Each video is crafted as a feature-length journey designed to help you drift into restful slumber while exploring the most fascinating stories ever told. Whether you're struggling with insomnia, seeking meditation companions, or simply love mythology and epic stories, you found the right place. In the twilight of the Roman Republic, as civil wars tore through Italy and blood soaked the streets of Rome itself, a poet named Virgil sat down to write an epic that would define an empire. The Aeneid would become more than just a story. It would become the founding myth of Roman civilization, a tale that connected the grandeur of Augustus Caesar's reign to the smoking ruins of Troy. And in doing so, it would legitimize an entirely new world order. We're going to explore every corner of this magnificent epic tonight. We'll walk through the burning streets of Troy with Aeneas, sail across the Mediterranean as he searches for a new homeland, descend into the underworld to glimpse Rome's glorious future, and witness the brutal wars that would finally establish the Trojan refugees in Italy. This is the story of destiny, duty, and the terrible price of founding an empire. Virgil and the Augustan Age. To understand the Aeneid, we first need to understand the world that produced it. Publius Vergilius Maro, known to us as Virgil, was born in 70 BCE near Mantua in northern Italy. He grew up during one of the most chaotic periods in Roman history. The Republic was dying, strangled by civil wars and power struggles between ambitious generals. When Virgil was a young man, Julius Caesar crossed the Rubicon with his armies and plunged Rome into civil war. Caesar's assassination in 44 BCE only made things worse. More civil wars followed. The second triumvirate of Octavian, Mark Antony, and Lepidus fought against Caesar's assassins, then turned on each other. Virgil watched as farms were confiscated to resettle veteran soldiers. He may have lost his own family's land in these upheavals, though the historical record is unclear on this point. Finally, in 31 BCE at the Battle of Actium, Octavian defeated Mark Antony and Cleopatra. For the first time in decades, Rome had a single ruler. 4 years later, Octavian took the title Augustus, becoming Rome's first emperor. The Republic was dead. The empire had begun. Augustus needed to legitimize his rule. He'd won power through violence and civil war, killing thousands of his fellow Romans. Now he wanted to be seen as a bringer of peace, a restorer of traditional Roman values, a ruler chosen by fate itself. He needed propaganda, and he needed it to be magnificent. That's where Virgil came in. Already famous for his pastoral eclogues and his agricultural poem, the Georgics, Virgil was the greatest poet of his generation. Augustus, through his friend and advisor Maecenas, essentially commissioned Virgil to write a national epic for Rome. The Greeks had Homer's Iliad and Odyssey. The Romans would have the Aeneid. Virgil worked on the poem for 11 years, from 29 to 19 BCE. He poured everything into it, crafting nearly 10,000 lines of dactylic hexameter verse. He drew on Homer, certainly, but also on Greek tragedy, on Roman history and legend, on philosophy. He created a work that was simultaneously a thrilling adventure story, a profound meditation on duty and sacrifice, and a justification for Roman imperial dominance. But Virgil never finished. In 19 BCE, planning to spend 3 more years revising the poem, he traveled to Greece to gather material for scenes set in Greek waters. There he encountered Augustus himself in Athens, The poet caught a fever, probably in the town of Megara. Weakened by illness, he made it back to Italy but died in the port city of Brundisium on September 21st. Legend says that with his dying breath, Virgil asked for the manuscript of the Aeneid to be burned. He considered it unfinished, imperfect, but Augustus overruled him. He ordered Virgil's literary executors, Lucius Varius Rufus and Plotius Tucca, to publish the poem with minimal editorial changes. And so the Aeneid entered the world, incomplete lines and all, to become one of the foundational texts of Western civilization. The poem Augustus received tells the story of Aeneas, a Trojan hero who escapes the fall of Troy and, after years of wandering, reaches Italy. There, after a bitter war, he establishes a settlement that will eventually become Rome. More importantly, Aeneas is portrayed as the ancestor of Augustus himself. The Julian family, to which both Julius Caesar and Augustus belonged, claimed descent from Iulus, also known as Ascanius, Aeneas' son, and Aeneas was the son of Venus. So Augustus could claim divine ancestry, blood connection to the goddess of love herself. The political message was clear. Augustus's rule wasn't an accident of civil war. It was destiny. It had been fated since the fall of Troy, prophesied by Jupiter himself, carried out by a hero whose defining virtue was pietas, dutiful reverence for the gods, family, and state. If Aeneas could abandon personal happiness to fulfill his destiny, so too could Rome accept Augustus's rule as the fulfillment of centuries of fate. But here's where the Aeneid becomes interesting. Because while it certainly serves as propaganda for Augustus, it's also much more complex than that. Virgil doesn't simply celebrate empire. He also shows its terrible costs. The most vivid characters in the poem are often those who suffer from Aeneas' mission, like the Carthaginian Queen Dido, who kills herself when Aeneas abandons her, or the Italian hero Turnus, who fights desperately against fate itself. The poem ends not with triumphant celebration, but with Aeneas killing Turnus in a moment of rage, an act that feels more like murder than heroism. Scholars have debated for 2,000 years whether Virgil truly believed in the Augustan vision or whether he subtly subverted it, whether the Aeneid is sincere propaganda or deeply ambivalent about empire. The truth is probably both. Virgil lived through terrible times. He'd seen civil war destroy everything. Augustus brought peace, but at the cost of liberty. The Aeneid reflects that complexity. Now, let's turn to the story itself, and we'll start where Virgil's narrative reaches its first great climax in Book 2, with the fall of Troy. The fall of Troy. The Aeneid doesn't begin at the beginning. Following Homer's example, Virgil starts his story in medias res, in the middle of things. We first meet Aeneas 7 years after the fall of Troy, shipwrecked on the coast of North Africa. But in Book 2, at a banquet given by Dido, Queen of Carthage, Aeneas tells the story of that terrible final night when Troy fell. It's a story his audience already knows, but Virgil retells it from the Trojan perspective, and that makes all the difference. Where Homer's Greeks are clever and brave, Virgil's Trojans are tragic victims of both Greek treachery and divine will. The Greeks had besieged Troy for 10 years and gotten nowhere. The city's walls were too strong. So they tried something different. They built an enormous wooden horse, filled it with their best warriors, and then pretended to sail away. They left the horse on the beach as an apparent offering to the goddess Minerva. The Trojans found it there in the morning. They were amazed, exhausted, hopeful that the war might finally be over. They debated what to do with this strange gift. Some wanted to drag it into the city. Others were suspicious. The priest Laocoon famously shouted, "I fear the Greeks even when they bring gifts," and hurled his spear at the horse's flank. If the Trojans had listened to him, everything might have been different. But then the Greeks' trap sprung. Trojan shepherds dragged before King Priam a Greek prisoner named Sinon. Sinon was a plant deliberately left behind to deceive the Trojans, but he played his role perfectly. He claimed to have deserted from the Greek army after learning he was to be sacrificed to ensure favorable winds for their voyage home. Sinon told an elaborate lie. He said the wooden horse was built as an offering to Minerva, whose sacred image the Greeks had stolen from Troy. The Greeks hoped the gift would appease her anger. They'd made it huge, he claimed, specifically so the Trojans couldn't bring it into their city. If they did, Sinon warned, Troy would be blessed with divine protection. If they harmed the horse, Troy would be destroyed. Worrying. This was brilliant reverse psychology. Sinon played on the Trojans' respect for the gods, their war weariness, their desperate hope that they'd actually won. And it might not have worked, except that the gods themselves intervened. As Laocoon prepared to sacrifice a bull at Neptune's altar, two enormous serpents rose from the sea. They slithered across the beach with terrible speed, their eyes burning, their crested heads raised. The crowd scattered in terror. But the serpents weren't interested in the crowd. They coiled around Laocoon's two young sons, strangling them as the boys screamed for their father. When Laocoon tried to save them, the serpents constricted around him too, crushing the life from all three even as the priests struggled to tear them away. The Trojans watched in horror. They interpreted this as divine punishment for Laocoon's attack on the horse, a sign that Minerva was angry and must be appeased. The serpents slithered up to Minerva's temple and disappeared. The message seemed clear: bring the horse into the city or face the goddess's wrath. So the Trojans tore down part of their own wall and dragged the horse through the breach. They celebrated, believing the war was finally over. Even Cassandra, the prophetess cursed to always speak the truth but never be believed, couldn't stop them. She warned them of their doom, but no one listened. They never did. That night, while Troy slept off its celebrations, Sinon crept to the horse and released the Greek warriors hidden inside. Meanwhile, the Greek fleet, which had only sailed behind the nearby island of Tenedos, returned to Troy's shore. The warriors inside the horse opened the city gates. The Greeks poured in. Troy was doomed. Aeneas tells Dido how he was sleeping when the ghost of Hector appeared to him in a dream. Hector had been Troy's greatest warrior before Achilles killed him. Now his shade looked terrible, mangled as it had been when Achilles dragged it behind his chariot around Troy's walls. Hector told Aeneas that Troy was lost. The city could not be saved. Aeneas must flee, taking Troy's household gods, the Pietas, and found a new city elsewhere across the sea. Aeneas woke to screams and the smell of smoke. He climbed to his roof and saw flames everywhere, the city burning, Greeks killing in the streets. His first instinct wasn't to flee, it was to fight. He armed himself and rushed out, joined by a few companions. They fought with desperate, suicidal courage. They killed Greek stragglers and took their armor as disguise. Using this trickery, they moved through Greek ranks, striking down enemies who thought they were allies. But the disguise couldn't last. One of Aeneas's companions, Corybus, saw his betrothed, the prophetess Cassandra, being dragged from Minerva's temple by Greek soldiers. He attacked them, blowing their cover. The Greeks realized the trick. In the battle that followed, Corybus was killed. Others fell. Aeneas and the survivors fought their way toward King Priam's palace. There, Aeneas witnessed one of the war's most terrible moments. The Greeks had broken into the palace. They hunted through the halls, searching for Priam's family. The old king armed himself one last time, despite his age, despite knowing it was hopeless. His wife begged him not to throw his life away, but Priam couldn't simply wait to die. Then Pyrrhus, son of Achilles, appeared. He'd just killed Priam's son, Polites, cutting him down in front of his parents. Now Pyrrhus advanced on Priam himself. The old king hurled his spear, but his strength was gone. The weapon barely reached Pyrrhus, clattering uselessly against his shield. Pyrrhus sneered and dragged Priam through the blood of his own son to the altar. There, in that sacred space, he cut the old king's throat. This death encapsulated Troy's fall. Priam had once ruled a mighty kingdom, father to 50 sons, master of Asia Minor. Now he died nameless at his own altar, his kingdom destroyed, his family murdered, his body left to rot. This was the price of war, the reality behind the glory. Aeneas wanted to kill Helen, the woman whose face had launched 1,000 ships and caused all this suffering. But his mother Venus appeared to him in that moment and stopped him. She showed him the truth. The gods themselves were tearing Troy down. He saw Neptune shaking the foundations with his trident, Juno throwing wide the city gates, even his mother's enemy Minerva with her Gorgon shield on the citadel. No mortal had truly won this war. The gods had decreed Troy's fall, and against divine will, no mortal could stand. Venus told her son to stop fighting and go to his family. His fate lay elsewhere. He needed to survive. Aeneas rushed home to his father Anchises, his son Ascanius, and his wife Creusa. But Anchises refused to leave. The old man had lived in Troy his entire life. He said he'd rather die than abandon his home and watch his city burn from some foreign shore. He told Aeneas to go, to save himself and the boy, but Anchises would stay. Aeneas armed himself again. If his father wouldn't leave, then Aeneas would die fighting. But then the gods sent signs. A harmless flame appeared above young Ascanius' head, hovering there without burning him. Anchises prayed for confirmation, and immediately thunder cracked on the left, the favorable side, and a bright star shot across the sky, falling toward Mount Ida. Anchises recognized these as divine omens. The gods wanted them to leave. They were meant to survive. He agreed to go. So Aeneas lifted his father onto his shoulders, took his son by the hand, and walked out of burning Troy. He carried the Penites, the household gods, symbols of Troy's continuity. Creusa followed behind, keeping her distance in case they were separated by Greeks or fire. They made it to the city gates, to the meeting point Aeneas had designated. But when Aeneas looked around, Creusa wasn't there. She'd been lost in the chaos. Aeneas left Anchises and Ascanius in safety and ran back into the burning city, calling for his wife. He searched everywhere, risking his life in streets full of Greeks and flames. Finally, Creusa's shade appeared before him. Her ghost told him not to grieve. This had been fated. She couldn't leave Troy, but he would find a new home in Hesperia, the western land of Italy. There he would take a royal bride and rule a great kingdom. Their son would carry on the family line. Aeneas tried 3 times to embrace her, but 3 times her shade slipped through his arms like smoke, like a dream that fades on waking. Then she was gone, returned to the realm of the dead. Aeneas made his way back to the meeting point. He found that their group had swelled with other refugees who'd survived the night. They fled together into the mountains as dawn broke over burning Troy. This is where Book 2 ends, with Aeneas shouldering his father once more and leading the survivors away from everything they'd ever known. Troy was gone. Their old lives were ashes, but they would survive because they had to, because fate demanded it. The cost of that survival and where it would lead them is the rest of the Aeneid story. The Mediterranean Wanderings. Book 3 of the Aeneid covers 7 years in less than 1,000 lines. Aeneas narrates for Dido a compressed account of his wanderings across the Mediterranean, a journey marked by false starts, cryptic prophecies, and mounting losses. The Trojan survivors built a fleet and set sail, searching for the new homeland the gods had promised. But where exactly were they supposed to go? The prophecies were maddeningly vague. They first landed in Thrace, on the northern edge of the Aegean Sea. Aeneas began preparing to found a city there, but when he pulled up plants to make offerings to the gods, blood dripped from the roots. He pulled another plant and more blood flowed. Then a voice came from the ground. It was Polydorus, one of Priam's sons. During the war, Priam had sent the boy to Thrace with a fortune in gold, hoping to keep at least one son and some wealth safe. But the Thracian king murdered Polydorus for the gold the moment Troy fell. His unburied body now corrupted the land. The Trojans gave him proper funeral rites and quickly sailed away. This land was cursed. Next, they reached Delos, the sacred island birthplace of Apollo. They consulted the oracle, and Apollo's voice boomed out, "Seek your ancient mother. There the house of Aeneas will rule all lands." But what did that mean? Ancient mother? Anchises interpreted this as Crete, because Teucrus, Troy's founder, had come from there originally. So they sailed to Crete and began building a settlement. For a time it looked promising. But then plague struck. The crops withered. People sickened and died. At night, as Aeneas slept in despair, the Penites themselves appeared to him and explained Anchises had misunderstood. Their true ancient mother was Hesperia, the western land of Italy. That was where Dardanus, another founder of the Trojan line, had originally come from before settling at Troy. They needed to sail west. They left Crete and island hopped across the Ionian Sea. On the Strophates Islands, they encountered the Harpies, vile creatures with women's faces and birds' bodies, who stole and fouled the Trojans' food. When Aeneas and his men tried to fight them off, the Harpy Silenos screeched a prophecy. They would reach Italy, yes, but hunger would drive them to eat their very tables before they could found their city. This disturbing prediction would haunt them for years. They sailed on to Actium, where they held athletic games and made offerings to Apollo, then to Buthrodum in Epirus, where they found something unexpected, a new Troy. The Trojan prophet Helenus, one of Priam's sons who'd survived, had ended up ruling here alongside Andromache, widow of the great Hector. Andromache had been enslaved after Troy's fall, passed first to Achilles' son Pyrrhus, then to Helenus after Pyrrhus was murdered. The Trojans found a bittersweet comfort here. This miniature Troy, with its imitation Scaean gate and dry stream named Simois after Troy's river, was a memorial of grief. Andromache still mourned Hector after all these years. But Helenus, with his prophetic gifts, could give Aeneas crucial guidance. Helenus warned them that their journey was far from over. They'd have to sail all the way around Italy to reach Latium on the western coast. They should avoid the eastern route through the strait between Italy and Sicily, where Scylla and Charybdis lurked. Scylla, a monster with 6 heads and 12 legs growing from her waist, would snatch sailors from their ships and devour them. Charybdis was a whirlpool that could swallow entire vessels. Better to take the long way around Sicily's southern coast. Most importantly, Helenus told Aeneas to seek out the Sibyl when he reached Cuma in Italy. This prophetess of Apollo would guide him further, even into the underworld itself if necessary. The Trojans left Buthrotum and followed Helenus's advice, sailing around Sicily. They caught a glimpse of Mount Etna erupting, its peak wreathed in smoke and flame. They beached on Sicily's coast, and there they encountered one of Odysseus's men, a Greek named Aeneid. This wretched man had been part of Odysseus's crew when they'd blinded the Cyclops Polyphemus. In the chaos of their escape, Aeneid had been left behind. He'd been hiding in the wilderness for months, surviving on berries and streams, watching the Cyclopes herd their flocks. He begged the Trojans to take him, even though he was Greek. He'd rather die at their hands than be caught by the Cyclopes. Even as he spoke, they saw Polyphemus himself, the blinded giant, feeling his way down to the shore to wash his eye socket. Other Cyclops appeared on the hills. The Trojans grabbed Achaemenides and rowed furiously away. Polyphemus heard them and waded into the sea, trying to reach their ships, but even his enormous height wasn't enough. He roared in fury, calling his fellow Cyclopes, but the Trojans escaped. They continued around Sicily, stopping at various ports. They reached Drepanum on the western coast, and their tragedy struck. Anchises, who'd survived Troy's fall and 7 years of wandering, who'd been the keeper of so much wisdom and tradition, died. Aeneas doesn't describe his father's death in detail. The grief is too raw. He simply says that Anchises died there, and it was after all his other sufferings the hardest blow of all. After burying his father, Aeneas set sail again, heading toward Italy. But then, as Book 3 ends, Juno sent the storm that drove them off course to Carthage, where we met them in Book 1. And that storm, that apparent setback, would lead to one of the Aeneid's most famous episodes. The wanderings of Book 3 establish patterns that will run through the whole epic. Prophecies given, prophecies misunderstood. Attempts to settle that fail. The Trojans trying to rebuild Troy instead of accepting they need to create something new. Divine signs pointing toward Italy, toward their destiny, but never making the path easy. And through it all, the mounting toll, death, loss, the slow grinding away of everything they'd known, preparing them for the moment when they'd have no choice but to embrace a new identity in a new land. But before they reach Italy, before Aeneas can fulfill his destiny, he'll face his greatest test of devotion to that destiny. He'll have to choose between love and duty, between personal happiness and the mission the gods have laid upon him. The choice will destroy a queen and echo through history. Dido and the Tragedy of Carthage. When the Trojans washed up on the North African coast, exhausted and battered by Juno's storm, they didn't know they'd landed near one of the most remarkable cities in the ancient Mediterranean. Carthage, though newly founded, was already becoming a power, and it was ruled by a queen who, like Aeneas, had fled her homeland and was building something new from loss. Dido's story parallels Aeneas's in striking ways. She'd been the princess of Tyre in Phoenicia, married to Sychaeus, a wealthy man she loved deeply. But her brother Pygmalion, the king, was greedy. He murdered Sychaeus for his wealth, doing it secretly at the altar. Dido didn't know the truth until Sychaeus' ghost appeared to her in a dream, showing his wounds and warning her to flee. Dido gathered followers, people who hated or feared Pygmalion, and escaped by sea with Sychaeus' hidden treasure. She reached North Africa and negotiated with the locals for land. The chieftain Iarbas offered to sell her as much land as she could encompass with a bull's hide. Dido showed her cleverness. She cut the hide into the thinnest possible strips and used them to encircle a hill overlooking the sea. There she founded Carthage, the new city. When Aeneas first saw Carthage, he was amazed. Just a few years old, it was already thriving. There were temples being built, a forum being laid out, walls rising, towers being constructed. The Carthaginians worked with a sense of purpose he recognized. They were building their future, just as he hoped to do someday. In the Temple of Juno, Aeneas saw something that moved him deeply. Murals depicting scenes from the Trojan War. Even here, at the edge of the known world, Troy's story was known. People remembered. He saw Priam, Achilles, Hector being dragged around the walls. He wept. What place has not known our suffering? Then Dido herself arrived to hear petitions and judge disputes. She was regal, confident, beautiful, and Aeneas' lost companions were there, brought before her, asking for help. Dido granted it immediately. She offered them shelter, provisions, even the chance to settle in Carthage if they wished. One city shall hold Trojans and Tyrians together. Aeneas stepped forward from the concealing mist Venus had wrapped around him. He thanked Dido for her kindness to his people. The queen was struck by him immediately. Here was a hero from the stories she'd seen depicted on her temple walls, standing before her in her own city. That evening, Dido held a banquet for the Trojans. She wanted to know everything about the fall of Troy, about Aeneas' wanderings, but Venus, protecting her son, decided to take no chances with his reception. She sent Cupid, disguised as Aeneas' son Ascanius, to sit on Dido's lap during the feast. As the false Ascanius nestled against her, Cupid worked his divine magic, kindling love in Dido's heart, making her forget her vow to remain faithful to Sychaeus' memory. By the time Aeneas began telling the story of Troy's fall, Dido was already falling in love with him. As he narrated through books 2 and 3, describing tragedy and loss, wandering and determination, she recognized a kindred spirit. Here was someone who understood what she'd been through, someone who'd lost everything and was trying to build something new. Book 4 opens with Dido consumed by this love. She tried to fight it. She'd sworn after Sychaeus' death that she'd never love again. She told her sister Anna that Aeneas was the first man since her husband to stir such feelings, but she must resist. Anna saw things differently. She argued that Dido was still young. She deserved happiness. And beyond personal feelings, there were practical considerations. Carthage was surrounded by hostile African tribes. Iarbas, the local king who'd sold her the land, wanted to marry her and was growing angry at her refusals. An alliance with the Trojans would strengthen Carthage immensely. Aeneas' warriors could defend the city. Dido let herself be convinced. Her resistance crumbled. She began neglecting her duties. Construction on Carthage slowed, then stopped. She wandered through the city thinking only of Aeneas. Virgil compares her to a doe struck by an arrow, running through the forests unaware the shaft still lodged in her side, the wound draining her life, even as she runs. This caught the attention of Juno. The queen of the gods had two concerns. First, she hated the Trojans and wanted to prevent them reaching Italy at any cost. Second, she loved Carthage. It was her favorite city. What if Dido and Aeneas married? The Trojans might settle here permanently. Rome would never be founded, and Carthage would become the great Mediterranean power instead. Juno proposed this to Venus. Let's unite Carthage and Troy through marriage. Venus, knowing Juno's real motive was to prevent the founding of Rome, pretended to agree while making her own plans. Juno arranged for Dido and the Trojans to go hunting. During the hunt, she'd send a storm. Aeneas and Dido would take shelter in the same cave. There, with Juno providing lightning as torches and nymphs singing as witnesses, they'd consummate their relationship. Dido would consider it a marriage. This is exactly what happened. They made love in the cave while the storm raged outside. When they emerged, Dido believed herself married to Aeneas. In her culture, the act itself was sufficient. No further ceremony was needed. But Aeneas, though he cared for Dido, never saw it as marriage. The poem is careful about this. Virgil says Dido called it marriage to cloak her sense of guilt. For a time, they lived together openly. Aeneas let himself forget his mission. He wore Tyrian purple, worked on Carthage's construction projects, carried a jeweled sword Dido had given him. He looked like a king consort, not a destined founder of Rome. But rumors spread. Rumor personified as a hideous monster with an eye under every feather, a tongue for each eye, an ear for every tongue, flew across Africa, spreading scandalized gossip about the foreign prince and the queen who'd abandoned her duties for lust. Iarbas heard. Furious that Dido had rejected him but accepted this Trojan refugee, he prayed to his father Jupiter. What was the point of honoring the gods if this was how they rewarded piety? A foreigner, a man descended from a woman married to a shepherd, wore perfumed robes in Carthage while Iarbas's altars went unattended. Jupiter looked down and saw what was happening. This wasn't supposed to be the story. Aeneas was meant for Italy, not Africa. So Jupiter sent Mercury to remind Aeneas of his destiny. Mercury flew to Carthage on his winged sandals and found Aeneas overseeing construction, wearing rich robes embroidered by Dido. The god's message was blunt and cutting. Are you laying the foundations of Carthage? Are you a servant to a woman? What about your son's future? What about Italy? What about the city you're supposed to found? Aeneas was thunderstruck. He knew Mercury was right. The reminder of his duty hit him like a physical blow. He immediately ordered his men to prepare the fleet in secret. They'd leave as soon as possible. But Dido sensed something was wrong. Maybe she saw the increased activity around the ships. Maybe she simply knew, the way lovers do, that something had changed. She confronted Aeneas. Her speech is one of the most powerful passages in Latin literature. She was shocked, hurt, furious, heartbroken all at once. You're leaving? Just like that? Sneaking away without even telling me? After everything we've shared? After what I've done for you? She reminded him that she'd taken him in when he had nothing. She'd given him her love, her city, her protection. She'd broken her vow to Sychaeus for him. And now he was abandoning her the way her brother had murdered her husband, taking everything and leaving her with nothing. She begged him to stay, or at least delay. If he cared for her at all, if their time together had meant anything, he'd wait until winter passed. Sailing in winter was dangerous. Wait for spring, or if not for her sake, for his own people's safety. And then, heartbreakingly, she said, if only she'd gotten pregnant. If she had a child from their time together, at least she'd have some piece of him to remember. A little Aeneas to run around her halls. Then she wouldn't feel so utterly abandoned. Aeneas tried to respond calmly. He never called their relationship marriage. He said he appreciated everything she'd done. He'd never forget her. But he had to go to Italy. It wasn't his choice. The gods commanded it. Mercury himself had just appeared with Jupiter's orders. He didn't want to leave, but fate left him no alternative. He had to think of his son's future, of the dynasty he was meant to found. His coldness made everything worse. Dido exploded. She called him heartless, born not from Venus but from rocks and tigers. She cursed him, prophesying that he'd face suffering in Italy, that he'd call her name in his anguish, that she'd haunt him as a shade when she died. And most famously, she cursed the future. Let no love or treaty ever unite our peoples. May an avenger rise from my bones to pursue the Trojan settlers with fire and sword, now and whenever our strength permits. This curse is why the poem mentions her. Roman readers knew the history. Centuries after Dido's time, Carthage would become Rome's greatest enemy. The Punic Wars would nearly destroy Rome. Hannibal, the Carthaginian general, would march through Spain and over the Alps with elephants, would devastate Italy for 15 years. Virgil's audience understood Dido's curse had been fulfilled. Rome won in the end, but the cost was staggering, and it all traced back to this moment, to Aeneas choosing duty over love, empire over personal happiness. Dido fled from their confrontation, fainting from grief. Her sister Anna caught her and carried her to bed. That night, tormented by nightmares and rage and sorrow, Dido made her decision. She told Anna she'd found a sorceress who could perform a ritual to either win Aeneas back or free Dido from her love. The ritual required building a pyre and burning everything Aeneas had touched, his clothes, their marriage bed, all the gifts he'd given her. Anna, desperate to help, arranged it all. Meanwhile, Mercury appeared to Aeneas again, urging him to leave immediately. Don't wait for morning. Dido and the Carthaginians might turn violent. The women of this city have already shown themselves capable of madness. Go now, while it's still dark, before they can stop you. Aeneas obeyed. In the middle of the night, the Trojan fleet slipped out of harbor. As dawn broke, Dido woke and saw the ships already at sea, the shore abandoned. She raved through Carthage. She wished she'd slaughtered the Trojans when they first arrived, fed Ascanius to his father at a feast like something from Greek tragedy. She wished she'd destroyed their ships. She wished for anything except this abandonment. She climbed the pyre Anna had built. At the top lay the bed she'd shared with Aeneas, his sword, his clothes. Dido took the sword. She made one final speech, reviewing her accomplishments. She'd founded Carthage. She'd avenged her murdered husband by escaping Pygmalion. She'd lived gloriously. The only stain was this, letting herself love again and being destroyed for it. She drove the sword into her chest. Her sister Anna and the attendants screamed. They tried to save her, but the wound was too deep. Dido lay dying on the pyre, the blood soaking the marriage bed. In agony, she tried to speak but could only stare at the sky. Juno, taking pity on her suffering, sent Iris, goddess of the rainbow, to release Dido's soul from her body. Iris descended and cut a lock of Dido's hair, the ritual that separates soul from flesh. Dido died. Anna ordered the pyre lit. Smoke rose into the sky. Out at sea, Aeneas saw it and wondered what caused such a great fire. He didn't know the truth, but he felt a terrible foreboding. The Trojans sailed on toward Italy, leaving Carthage and its dead queen behind. This is the episode that makes many modern readers uncomfortable with Aeneas. He seems callous, putting destiny before the woman who saved him. But that's precisely Virgil's point. The Roman virtue of pietas meant subordinating personal desires to duty. Aeneas represents that ideal, but Virgil doesn't hide its cost. Dido is vivid, passionate, tragic. Her death feels like a crime. Maybe Virgil thought it was, at least on some level. The price of empire, the poem suggests, is always paid in someone else's blood. The Trojans would finally reach Italy, but Dido's curse would follow them, and her shade would remain unforgiving. Journey's continuation and arrival. Book 5 takes us to Sicily, where the Trojans had stopped the year before when Anchises died. Now Aeneas returns to hold proper funeral games in his father's honor. It's the epic's calmest book, a moment of ritual and athletic competition before the intensity of the underworld journey and the Italian wars. Aeneas proclaims games to honor Anchises: boat races, foot races, boxing, archery. These contests let Virgil showcase different Trojan heroes, give them personalities beyond simply being Aeneas's followers. There's Gaius, the hot-tempered captain, who throws his helmsman overboard when they lose the boat race. There's Nisus, who slips in blood during the foot race and trips the runner who'd overtaken him, ensuring his beloved Euryalus wins instead. There's old Entellus, who'd retired from boxing but is goaded back into the ring and nearly kills his younger opponent. The games celebrate community, martial valor, and tradition. They're also very Roman. Augustus himself sponsored games, and Virgil's Roman readers would have recognized this as the kind of event that bonded a people together. The Trojans weren't just refugees anymore, they were becoming a nation. But Juno hadn't given up on preventing the founding of Rome. While the men competed, she sent Iris in disguise among the Trojan women. These women were exhausted. 7 years of sailing, of false starts and dangers, of losing husbands and sons, of never having a home. Iris inflamed their desperation. Why keep sailing? Why not stay here in Sicily, where they'd been welcomed, where there was peace? The women began burning the ships. By the time the men noticed, flames were already climbing the masts. They rushed to stop it, but the fire was spreading too fast. Aeneas prayed to Jupiter, and the king of gods sent rain, a deluge that drowned the flames. Still, 4 ships were destroyed. This was a crisis. Many Trojans were ready to give up. An old seer named Nautes advised Aeneas, "Let those who want to stay remain here. The weary, the old, the women who can't face more voyaging can settle in Sicily. Build them a city. Only the strongest, the most committed, will continue to Italy." Aeneas did this. He founded a settlement in Sicily for those who couldn't go on. And that night, Anchises' shade appeared to him in a dream. His father confirmed this was the right choice. More importantly, Anchises told Aeneas that before starting his war in Italy, he must descend to the underworld. In the Elysian fields, Anchises would show his son the future of Rome, the great heroes who would descend from him, the destiny that made all this suffering worthwhile. So Aeneas and the remainder of his fleet sailed for Italy, but they'd lose one more before arriving. Palinurus, the pilot, was steering through the night when the god of sleep appeared and urged him to rest. Palinurus refused. He'd never abandon his duty. Sleep, using divine power, overwhelmed him anyway. Palinurus fell from the stern, still clutching the steering oar, and plunged into the sea. The gods carried him to shore alive, but locals killed him for his equipment. He died unburied, his shade unable to cross the Styx. When Aeneas woke and realized Palinurus was gone, he took the steering oar himself and guided the fleet to Italy. They finally reached the bay at Cumae, near what would one day be Naples. 7 years after leaving Troy, the Trojans had reached the land that had been promised to them. But before Aeneas could begin founding his city, before he could fight for his place in Italy, he had an appointment with the dead. The underworld called. Descent to the underworld. Cumae was home to a famous oracle, the Sibyl of Apollo, a priestess who channeled the god's prophecies. Aeneas climbed to her cave, a place with 100 doors that would throw open when the god possessed her, and she spoke his words. Morti, the Sibyl was ancient, incredibly old. She'd asked Apollo for immortality and been granted it, but she'd forgotten to ask for eternal youth. She'd been aging for centuries, growing ever more decrepit. By the time Aeneas met her, she was shriveled, withered, more voice than body. Aeneas prayed to Apollo. He asked for a homeland in Italy, an end to the Trojans' wandering. In return, he promised to build a temple, to establish festivals, to honor Apollo forever. The god possessed the Sibyl, and she prophesied. Italy awaited him, yes, but so did terrible war, a foe as formidable as Achilles, suffering that would match everything the Trojans had already endured. Blood would stain the Tiber. And yet, strangely, salvation would come from a Greek city. This last part was cryptic, but would be explained later. Aeneas made another request. His father had appeared to him and told him to descend to the underworld. Could the Sibyl guide him there and back? She answered that going down to the underworld was easy. Pluto's door stood open night and day. But returning to the living world, that was the challenge. Only a very few had managed it. Heroes descended from gods, souls blessed by Jupiter himself. Still, if Aeneas was determined, there were things he must do. First, hidden in a forest nearby, was a tree bearing a golden bough. He must find this bough and pluck it. If fate called him, the bough would come away easily. If not, no force could break it. The bough was sacred to Proserpina, queen of the underworld. Presenting it was the price of entry. Second, Aeneas's company had been contaminated by death. One of his men had died and remained unburied. They had to find the body and give it proper funeral rites. Then they could proceed. Aeneas searched his camp and found that Maecenas, his trumpeter, had drowned. They built an enormous funeral pyre for him, heaping it with offerings, then lit it and gathered his ashes. A proper burial restored the ritual purity of the Trojan company. Then Aeneas searched for the golden bough. His mother Venus sent 2 doves to guide him. They led him deep into the forest, to a dark valley, to a tree that gleamed even in shadow. The golden bough grew there, its metallic leaves rustling. Aeneas reached for it, and it came away easily in his hand. Fate had chosen him. He could descend. The Sibyl prepared the way. She sacrificed 4 black bullocks to Hecate, goddess of crossroads and magic. As dawn broke, the earth rumbled. Dogs howled in the distance. The goddess was coming. The Sibyl cried out for Aeneas to draw his sword and enter the cavern. They descended into the earth together. The entrance to the underworld was a terrible place. Here dwelled personified nightmares, grief, cares, disease, old age, fear, hunger, poverty, death, suffering, war. False dreams roosted on an elm tree. Monsters lurked in the shadows, centaurs, Scyllas, the 100-armed Briareus, the Hydra. Aeneas drew his sword to attack them, but the Sibyl stopped him. They were shades, forms without substance. His blade would pass through them. They reached the river Acheron, where the dead gathered on the bank. Thousands of souls crowded there, begging for passage across. Charon, the ferryman, stood in his battered boat. He was hideous, unkempt, fire-eyed, with a dirty cloak knotted at his throat. He ferried some souls across but drove others back. The Sibyl explained, only the properly buried could cross immediately. The others, like Palinurus, who died unburied, had to wait 100 years on these banks before Charon would take them. Sure enough, Aeneas saw Palinurus among the waiting dead. His pilot begged him for help. Take me across, or at least go back and bury my body so my shade can rest. But the Sibyl refused. Palinurus couldn't change his fate. However, she promised that local people would eventually be compelled by divine signs to bury his body. A cape would be named after him. It was small comfort. Charon challenged them. What are you doing here? You're alive. No living man crosses my river. But when the Sibyl showed him the golden bow, Charon relented. The bow was Proserpina's sign. They could pass. He ferried them across, though his boat sat dangerously low in the water under Aeneas's living weight. On the far shore crouched Cerberus, the three-headed hound of hell. The Sibyl drugged a honey cake and threw it to him. All three heads snapped at it. Cerberus gulped it down and immediately fell into drugged sleep. They passed over his body. The underworld was organized by how people had died and who they'd been in life. First came the souls of infants who died too young, then suicides, then those killed by false accusations, then the fields of mourning, where those who died for love wandered. Here, Aeneas saw Dido. He approached her shade, weeping. He tried to explain. He never wanted to leave her. The gods commanded it. He'd been forced to choose between her and his destiny. Could she forgive him? But Dido's shade wouldn't even look at him. She turned away, her face as hard as flint. Then she fled to the shade of Sychaeus, her first husband, who comforted her. Aeneas stood there bereft, but he couldn't follow. He had to move on. They passed through a region where great warriors' shades lived. The Greek heroes fled from Aeneas in death as they'd fought him in life. But the Trojan shades gathered around him, happy to see their prince again. The shade of Deiphobus, who'd married Helen after Paris died, was there, horribly mutilated from what Helen and the Greeks did to him the night Troy fell. He and Aeneas talked, but the Sibyl urged them onward. Time was limited. They came to a fork in the road. To the left lay Tartarus, the deepest pit of hell, where the truly wicked were punished for eternity. They couldn't enter there, but they heard the sounds, screaming, chains, the crack of whips. The Sibyl described what lay beyond. The Titans imprisoned after their war with the gods, those who'd murdered their fathers or defrauded clients or committed incest, those who'd betrayed their country, those who'd sold out for gold. Infinite punishments for infinite crimes. To the right, the path led to the Elysian fields. Here Aeneas used the golden bow, offering it to Proserpina as he'd been instructed. The gates opened. They entered paradise. The Elysian fields were beautiful beyond description. A purple light filled the air. Green meadows stretched forever. The blessed dead played sports, sang songs, danced. These were the heroic and virtuous shades, enjoying eternal peace. Ancient priests were here, great poets, those who'd improved human life through their art or wisdom. Aeneas searched for his father and finally found Anchises standing on a ridge, looking down at a valley where souls gathered in an enormous crowd. These souls were waiting to be reborn. Anchises was watching them, reviewing his descendants, all those who would one day be born into the world above. Father and son rushed toward each other. Aeneas tried 3 times to embrace Anchises, and 3 times the shade slipped through his arms like smoke. But they could speak, and Anchises had so much to show his son. He explained the metaphysics first. All living things contained a spark of divine fire, a portion of the world soul. But material bodies trapped and corrupted this fire. When people died, their souls needed purification. Most went through a cleansing process, suffering torments that burned away the contamination of life. After 1,000 years, purified at last, they drank from the river Lethe and forgot their past lives. Then they were reborn into new bodies, given new chances. The crowd Anchises was watching contained souls about to be reborn, and among them were Aeneas's descendants, all the heroes of Rome yet to come. Anchises began pointing them out. There was Silvius, the son Aeneas would have with Lavinia. There were the kings of Alba Longa, the city Ascanius would found. There was Romulus, who'd establish Rome itself, surrounded by his 7 hills. And there, most glorious of all, was Augustus Caesar. Anchises prophesied Augustus's golden age. This man would extend Rome's empire to the very ends of the earth. He'd bring back the age of Saturn, when peace and justice ruled. He'd surpass even Hercules and Bacchus in the magnitude of his achievements. But Anchises wasn't just showing Aeneas emperors. He showed the kings of Rome, Numa the lawgiver, Tullus the warrior, Ancus who'd follow them. He showed Brutus who'd overthrow the kings and establish the republic, and who'd execute his own sons when they tried to restore the monarchy. He showed the heroes of the Punic Wars, the men who'd defend Rome against Carthage. He showed great statesmen, generals, poets. Then Anchises gave the mission statement of Rome itself. Other people, he said, might surpass Romans in arts or sciences. The Greeks would always be better sculptors, orators, astronomers. But Rome's arts were these: to rule the nations with authority, to establish peace under law, to spare the conquered and war down the proud. This was the justification for empire. Rome wouldn't create the finest art or the deepest philosophy, but Rome would bring order, peace, justice. The cost in blood and suffering would be repaid by centuries of stability and law. Finally, Anchises showed Aeneas a young man, handsome but shadowed. "Who is he?" Aeneas asked. Anchises wept. This was Marcellus, Augustus's nephew and designated heir, a young man of extraordinary promise. But he would die before his time at age 19, leaving Rome to mourn what might have been. Virgil's first readers knew this tragedy. Marcellus died in 23 BCE while Virgil was writing the Aeneid. The poet's tribute to the dead young prince moved audiences so deeply that legend says Marcellus's mother fainted when Virgil recited these lines. The prophecy complete, Anchises escorted Aeneas and the Sibyl back to the land of the living. But oddly, they exited through the gates of ivory, the gates of false dreams rather than the gates of horn, which were for true shades. Scholars have debated this choice for 2,000 years. Was Virgil suggesting the vision of Rome's glory was somehow false? Or simply that Aeneas, being alive, couldn't use the gates reserved for genuine shades? The ambiguity remains. Aeneas rejoined his fleet. Now he'd seen the future. He understood why the suffering mattered. Everything that would come from his mission, the centuries of Roman glory, the heroes yet unborn, the empire that would span the world. The price was high, but the destiny was magnificent. With this knowledge burning in his mind, Aeneas prepared to face the final challenge, making good on that destiny by conquering a place for his people in Italy. Arrival in Latium and the stirring of war. The Trojans sailed north from Cumae and finally reached the mouth of the Tiber River. This was Latium, the land promised to them by prophecy. After 7 years of wandering, after countless losses and hardships, they'd arrived at their destined homeland. The region was ruled by King Latinus, an elderly monarch descended from the god Faunus and the nymph Marica. Latinus had one daughter, Lavinia, who'd reached marriageable age. Many local princes sought her hand, especially Turnus, king of the neighboring Rutulians, a handsome, fierce warrior who'd been courting Lavinia for years with her mother Amata's blessing. But omens troubled Latinus. His household gods had spoken to him in dreams, warning that Lavinia must not marry any Latin suitor. Instead, she was destined for a foreign husband who would come from across the sea. From their union would come a race that would rule the world, whose fame would reach to the stars. When Aeneas sent ambassadors to Latinus requesting permission to settle peacefully in the area, offering friendship and alliance, Latinus recognized the fulfillment of prophecy. These Trojans, led by a prince descended from gods, arriving from across the Mediterranean, clearly were the foreigners the omens had described. Latinus welcomed them warmly. He promised them land for a settlement, and he hinted strongly that Aeneas himself was destined to marry Lavinia. This should have been the happy ending. The Trojans had reached their promised land. The local king welcomed them. A marriage alliance would unite the peoples peacefully. Rome could be founded without more bloodshed. But Juno still hadn't given up. She'd failed to destroy the Trojans at sea, failed to trap them in Carthage. Now, with them on the very threshold of their destiny, she decided if she couldn't prevent their success entirely, she could at least delay it, make it as painful as possible, and ensure that Aeneas would never enjoy his victory in peace. Juno descended to the underworld and summoned Alecto, one of the Furies, a terrible goddess of vengeance with serpents in her hair and poison dripping from her mouth. Juno commanded Alecto to spread hatred and madness, to turn the Italians against the Trojans, to make sure that Aeneas would have to fight for every inch of Italy he claimed. Alecto went first to Queen Amata. The Fury breathed poison into the queen's heart, filling her with rage against the Trojans and desperate love for Turnus. Amata had always wanted Turnus as a son-in-law. Now, infected with Alecto's madness, she became obsessed. She raved through the palace, demanding that Latinus refuse the Trojans. When her husband wouldn't listen, she grabbed Lavinia and fled into the wilderness, hiding her daughter among the worshippers of Bacchus who roamed the mountains in ecstatic frenzy. She declared that only Bacchus would give Lavinia in marriage, not to any Trojan interloper. Next, Alecto visited Turnus, She found him sleeping in his palace at Ardea and appeared to him in a dream, disguised as an old priestess. She'd taunted him. The Trojans were stealing his bride, stealing his rightful place in Latium. Would he let foreigners take everything he'd earned, or would he fight? Turnus woke in fury. He'd been courting Lavinia for years. He'd defended Latium against foreign threats. He had every right to marry the princess. These Trojan refugees, these homeless wanderers, thought they could just arrive and take what was his. He called his people to arms. The Rutulians prepared for war. But Alecto wasn't finished. She needed to ensure the violence would actually start, not just be threatened. So she engineered an incident designed to inflame passions on both sides. Ascanius, Aeneas's young son, was out hunting with some companions. Alecto drove them to chase a pet stag belonging to Silvia, daughter of the king's herdsman. The stag was tame, beloved, adorned with garlands. Ascanius's hounds cornered it, and the boy shot it with an arrow. The stag fled home to die in Silvia's arms. The Latin herdsmen were outraged. A foreign boy had killed their princess's pet. They grabbed weapons, pitchforks, axes, burning brands, whatever they could find, and attacked the Trojans. A brawl erupted. Men died on both sides. Blood had been spilled. The war had begun. Latinus tried desperately to stop it. He refused to formally declare war. But the momentum was unstoppable. The Italian peoples rallied to Turnus. They saw the Trojans as invaders, foreigners trying to steal their land and their princess. War fever spread across Latium. Turnus gathered an impressive coalition. The Latins themselves, of course, led by the war leader Messapus. The Rutulians, Turnus's own fierce warriors. The Volscians, led by the warrior maiden Camilla, who'd been raised in the wilderness and could run across fields of grain without bending the stalks, or across the sea without wetting her feet. The Etruscans from Mezentius's territory, though Mezentius himself was a hated tyrant. Warriors from all across Italy, drawn by Turnus's charisma and hatred of foreign invaders. Aeneas was dismayed. He'd come in peace. He'd offered friendship. Now he faced a war that might destroy his people when they'd finally reached their promised land. But that night, the river god Tiberinus appeared to him in a dream. The god told Aeneas not to fear. This was his destined homeland. The war would be won. To ensure victory, Aeneas should sail up the Tiber to find Pallanteum, a small Arcadian settlement ruled by King Evander. The Arcadians were also foreigners in Italy, Greeks who'd emigrated generations ago. They'd be natural allies. More importantly, Evander could connect Aeneas with the Etruscans who'd recently overthrown Mezentius and now sought a foreign leader to help them fight against Turnus, just as prophecy required. Tiberinus gave Aeneas a sign. In the morning, he'd find a white sow with 30 white piglets beneath an oak tree. This was the spot where, 30 years hence, Ascanius would found the city of Alba Longa, Rome's precursor. Aeneas found the sow exactly where the god had said. He sacrificed her to Juno, still hoping to appease the goddess's anger. Then he took a small group of men and sailed up the Tiber, leaving the main Trojan force to defend their beachhead camp. They reached Pallanteum just as King Evander was celebrating a festival to Hercules. The Arcadians welcomed them cautiously, but when Evander learned who Aeneas was, he was delighted. Years ago, Evander had briefly met Aeneas's father, Anchises. They'd exchanged gifts of friendship. Now Evander could honor that old bond by helping Anchises' son. More importantly, Evander hated Mezentius and was happy to make war on the tyrant's allies. He offered Aeneas his own forces, small though they were, and more importantly, he offered his only son Pallas to accompany Aeneas as both warrior and ambassador to the Etruscans. Evander took Aeneas on a tour of Pallanteum. This small settlement of huts and simple buildings stood on the hills where Rome itself would one day rise. Evander showed Aeneas the cave where Hercules had fought the monster Cacus. He showed him the Capitoline Hill, already sacred, though no temple yet crowned it. He showed him the forums and marketplaces and monuments that would, centuries hence, define the eternal city. It was a tour of shadows, of potential, of prophecy half visible. Aeneas walked through his people's future, seeing in his mind's eye what Anchises had shown him in the underworld. This small village of Arcadian exiles would become the heart of an empire. That night, as Aeneas slept in Evander's palace, his mother Venus visited his dreams. She'd commissioned her husband, Vulcan, god of the forge, to make armor for her son. When Aeneas woke, he found the divine gifts waiting for him. The armor was magnificent beyond description. The shield especially was a wonder. On it, Vulcan had depicted scenes from Rome's future. There was Romulus and Remus nursed by the she-wolf. There was the rape of the Sabine women and the wars that followed. There were the kings of Rome, the expulsion of the tyrant Tarquin, Brutus executing his own sons to preserve the Republic. There was Horatius defending the bridge, Cloelia escaping captivity. And at the center of the shield was the Battle of Actium, where Augustus would defeat Antony and Cleopatra, establishing peace after decades of civil war. Augustus appeared triumphant, reviewing his troops, dedicating temples, establishing order. The gods themselves fought at Actium on the shield, Neptune and Venus and Mars supporting Augustus, while monstrous Egyptian gods opposed him. Aeneas didn't understand most of what he saw. He couldn't know these stories, couldn't recognize these heroes. But he felt their importance. He lifted the shield onto his shoulder, taking up the weight of Rome's entire history, all its glory and all its violence, carrying it into battle. With Pallas at his side and the Etruscan forces promised, Aeneas prepared to return to his people and face Turnus's army. The war for Italy was about to begin in earnest. The Great War intensifies. While Aeneas was away seeking allies, Turnus attacked the Trojan camp. He hoped to destroy them before their leader returned, before reinforcements could arrive. The Trojans, following Aeneas's orders, stayed within their fortifications and didn't engage in open battle. They held their walls and waited. Frustrated by their refusal to come out and fight, Turnus tried to set their ships on fire. But Cybele, the mother of the gods, had blessed those ships when they were built from trees, sacred to her on Mount Ida. As the flames touched them, Jupiter transformed the ships into sea nymphs. They dove into the water and swam away, saved by divine intervention. The sign should have warned Turnus off. Instead, he interpreted it as good news. Now the Trojans couldn't escape by sea. They were trapped in Italy, forced to stand and fight. That night, two young Trojans, Nisus and Euryalus, attempted a desperate mission. Nisus was an experienced warrior. Euryalus was barely more than a boy, beautiful and brave. They loved each other with a devotion that went beyond ordinary friendship. Nisus proposed they sneak through the enemy lines to reach Aeneas and report on the attack. The mission was almost certainly suicidal, but if they succeeded, they'd save their people. The Trojan leaders approved the plan. They promised Euryalus' mother that her son would be honored if he died, that she'd be cared for in his memory. The two young men set out into the darkness. At first, everything went perfectly. The Rutulians and their allies had celebrated their apparent victory with too much wine. Many sentries slept. Nisus and Euryalus passed through the camp silently, and in their silence, they couldn't resist the temptation to kill. They slaughtered sleeping men, cut throats, took revenge for the siege. Euryalus found a beautiful helmet and put it on, unable to resist the trophy. This vanity killed him. As they finally cleared the enemy camp and approached the woods, a cavalry patrol spotted them. The moonlight gleamed off Euryalus' stolen helmet. The cavalry gave chase. Nisus escaped into the forest, but when he realized Euryalus wasn't with him, he circled back. He found the cavalry surrounding his beloved, who couldn't run fast enough with all of his stolen armor weighing him down. Nisus threw his spear from hiding, killing one of the attackers. He threw again, killing another, but now they knew where he was. The cavalry commander, enraged, drew his sword and advanced on Euryalus. Nisus burst from the trees, crying out that he was the one responsible, that Euryalus was innocent, had only followed his lead. But it was too late. The sword came down. Euryalus fell, his beautiful youth cut short. Nisus threw himself at his friend's killers. He managed to slay the commander before the other soldiers cut him down. He died falling across Euryalus' body, and the two were together even in death. In the morning, the Rutulians mounted Nisus' and Euryalus' heads on spears and displayed them in front of the Trojan walls. When Euryalus' mother saw her son's severed head, she ran screaming onto the walls, begging to be killed, unable to bear her grief. The Trojans had to drag her away, still shrieking her lament. The battle grew more savage. Turnus broke through the Trojan gates and fought inside their camp, killing dozens before he was forced to escape by jumping into the Tiber and swimming back to his own lines. Then Aeneas returned with his allies. The Etruscans, the Arcadians, and the Trojans together marched on Turnus' positions. Now the Italians faced a war on two fronts, besiegers becoming besieged. The fighting was brutal. This was no glorious combat of heroes. This was killing that felt random, meaningless. Young men died by the dozens, by the hundreds. Virgil names many of them: Latagus, Palmus, Theron, Haemon, so many others. He gives them identities, backstories, families waiting for them at home, just before describing their deaths. And in the chaos of slaughter, Pallas, Evander's son, led the Arcadians against the Rutulians. He was young, perhaps 19, brave and skilled, but he'd never faced anyone like Turnus. Turnus saw Pallas cutting through his men and recognized an opportunity. He called out to the young prince, challenging him to single combat. Pallas knew he was outmatched, but he couldn't refuse. His honor, his father's honor, his people's confidence in him, everything demanded he fight. They met in the open space that formed when the surrounding warriors drew back to watch. Pallas hurled his spear with all his strength. It grazed Turnus' shoulder, drawing blood but doing no real harm. Then Turnus threw his spear. It punched through Pallas' shield, through his breastplate, through his chest. The young man fell, dying instantly. Turnus stood over him and pulled off his sword belt, a beautiful piece of metalwork showing the story of the 50 sons of Aegyptus murdered on their wedding night. Turnus took it as a trophy. He didn't know, couldn't know, that this act This moment of stripping the dead would seal his own fate. When the news reached Evander, the old king was destroyed. He'd sent his only son to war, knowing the risk, hoping the alliance with Aeneas would protect the boy. Now Pallas was dead, and Evander had nothing left except memories and grief. When Aeneas learned of Pallas's death, his grief turned to rage. He went through the battlefield like a fury himself, seeking Turnus, killing anyone in his path. He took prisoners specifically to sacrifice them at Pallas's funeral pyre, human offerings to the shade of his young friend. Aeneas fought and killed Lausus, the young son of the tyrant Mezentius. Lausus died protecting his father, showing a filial devotion that moved even Aeneas. After killing the boy, Aeneas felt pity and regret, but the battle's momentum carried him forward. Then came Mezentius himself, the hated tyrant, the god-scorner who prayed only to his own strength. Aeneas and Mezentius fought with savage intensity. The Rutulian's horse was killed, pinning him beneath it. Aeneas approached for the kill. Mezentius, showing more courage in death than he'd ever shown in life, asked only that Aeneas make sure he was buried with his son. They'd been separated in life by Mezentius's cruelty, but perhaps in death they could be together. The killing went on. Camilla, the warrior maiden, led the Volscian cavalry with incredible skill. She was death on horseback, her spear and arrows never missing, her movements too fast to follow. She cut through Aeneas's allies like a scythe through grain. Diana herself, goddess of the hunt, watched from Olympus and grieved, knowing Camilla's fate was already sealed. An Etruscan priest named Aruns stalked Camilla across the battlefield. He waited for his moment, and when Camilla was distracted chasing a trophy she wanted, Aruns threw his javelin. It struck her beneath her exposed breast. Camilla fell from her horse, dying. With her last breath, she sent word to Turnus that he needed to defend the city walls, that the Trojans were coming. Diana's attendant Opis, watching this death, hunted down Aruns and shot him in revenge, but it couldn't bring Camilla back. The war ground on, battle after battle, death after death. Both sides were exhausted. The Italians couldn't win, but they couldn't surrender. The Trojans had fate on their side, but that didn't stop their soldiers from dying. Finally, Turnus made a decision. This war had started because of him, because of his refusal to give up Lavinia, because of his determination to fight fate itself. Hundreds had died for his pride. It was time to end it. He sent word to Aeneas, single combat. Let them settle this between themselves, warrior to warrior. The winner would have Lavinia and peace. The loser would have death. No more meaningless slaughter, just the two of them and destiny. Aeneas agreed immediately. This was how it should have been from the start. The final battle and Turnus's fate. On the morning set for the duel, both armies assembled on a wide plain outside King Latinus's city. The Trojans and Etruscans on one side, the Rutulians and Latins on the other, with space left open in the center for the two champions to meet. King Latinus rode out and made sacrifices to the gods. He swore that if Turnus won, the Trojans would leave Italy forever and never return. Aeneas made his own oath. If he won, the Trojans and Latins would live as equals. Latinus would remain king. The Trojans wouldn't rule over the Latins, but merge with them. A new people would be born from both, taking the Latin name but infused with Trojan strength. Everything was prepared for an honorable resolution. But Juno still couldn't let fate proceed unhindered. She sent Turnus's sister Juturna, a river nymph elevated to minor divinity, to delay the inevitable. Juturna, desperate to save her brother, disguised herself as a Latin officer and moved through the Italian ranks, stirring up dissent. She asked the Italians how they could let one man fight for all of them. Look at the numbers. They had twice as many warriors as the Trojans. If they attacked now, while the enemy stood ready for a duel instead of a battle, they could win. As a sign, she conjured an omen. An eagle swooped down and seized a swan, but smaller birds mobbed the eagle, forcing it to drop its prey. The Italian augurs interpreted this to mean that many small fighters could defeat a single great one. A young warrior, inflamed by Juturna's words and the omen, hurled his spear at the Trojans. It struck a man dead. The truce shattered. Warriors on both sides grabbed their weapons and rushed forward. Aeneas tried to stop it. He stood in the open, shouting for his men to hold, insisting they honor the treaty. But in the chaos, someone shot an arrow that struck Aeneas in the leg. The wound forced him to retreat from the field. Turnus saw his enemy limping away and thought the gods had given him one last chance. He leapt into his chariot and plunged into battle, killing Trojans with wild abandon. He felt invincible. Victory seemed possible after all. But Venus couldn't let her son die from a narrow wound. She brought a healing herb, dittany, which grew only on Mount Ida near Troy, and mixed it with ambrosia and panacea. Iapix, Aeneas's physician, applied the mixture to the wound without knowing what it was. The arrow slid out painlessly. The wound sealed. Strength flooded back into Aeneas's leg. He armed himself again and returned to the battlefield, more terrible in his anger than before. When Turnus saw Aeneas coming, shining in his divine armor, he knew it was over. Fate had caught up with him. But just then, word arrived from the city. The Trojans were attacking the walls. Latinus's people were in danger. Queen Amata believed Turnus must be dead, and in her despair had hanged herself. The city was falling apart. Juturna, still disguised as Turnus's charioteer, tried to keep her brother on the battlefield, away from Aeneas. But Turnus saw through her disguise. He recognized his sister and understood what she was doing. He told her to stop. He'd seen too many die for him: Pallas, Lausus, Camilla, Mezentius, hundreds of others. He wouldn't run anymore. It was time to face Aeneas and fate together. Turnus dismissed his sister from the chariot. He called out across the battlefield for Aeneas to meet him. The fighting stopped. Warriors on both sides drew back to watch. The two men faced each other in the sudden silence. Turnus was magnificent in his armor, but there was something desperate in his eyes. Aeneas was cold, implacable, wrapped in the authority of destiny itself. They hurled their spears simultaneously. The weapons struck shields and glanced off. Then they closed with swords, hammering at each other with tremendous force. Turnus struck with all his strength, bringing his sword down on Aeneas's shield, but the blade shattered. This wasn't his father's sword, the one made by Vulcan and tempered in the Styx. In his rush to battle, he'd accidentally grabbed his charioteer's inferior weapon. Now he was disarmed. Turnus ran. He circled the battlefield, trying to reach his troops, trying to get his real sword. Aeneas pursued him, hampered by his wounded leg, but implacable. Aeneas's spear had lodged in the stump of an olive tree sacred to Faunus. He struggled to pull it free. Jupiter, watching from Olympus, finally turned to Juno. Enough. How long would she keep fighting fate? When would she accept that Aeneas was destined to win, that Rome would be founded, that her hatred had to end? Juno, for the first time, gave in. She couldn't change the outcome. She never could have. But she asked one favor. When the Trojans and Latins merged, let the Latin name survive. Let their language be preserved. Let it not be a Trojan conquest, but a true union. Jupiter granted this. The Trojans would disappear as a separate people. The name of Troy would fade from history, but its essence would continue in a new nation, the Romans, who would take Latin names and speak the Latin tongue while carrying Trojan blood and Trojan gods. Juno accepted this compromise. She withdrew her protection from Turnus. She called off Juturna. The fight would now proceed without divine interference. Jupiter sent a Fury to enforce his will. The creature took the form of an owl and flew at Turnus, harassing him, filling him with terror. Juturna saw the omen and knew what it meant. Her brother was doomed. Weeping, she abandoned him and fled to her river. Aeneas freed his spear from the tree. Turnus, seeing him coming, made one last desperate attempt. He tried to lift an enormous boundary stone and throw it at Aeneas, but his strength failed. Fear paralyzed him. The rock barely left his hands before falling short. Aeneas's spear flew true. It struck Turnus in the thigh, punching through his armor, driving him to his knees. Turnus fell to the ground, wounded, defeated. He looked up at Aeneas and spoke his final words. "You've won. I don't beg for my life. Take your victory, but if you have any pity, think of your own father. Let my father have my body. Let me be buried. Let Daunus have that comfort at least." Aeneas hesitated. He held his sword above Turnus's head, and for a moment, something like mercy flickered across his face. Turnus had fought bravely. He'd only been following his own understanding of honor. He was defeated now, no longer a threat. Perhaps he could be spared. But then Aeneas saw it. There, on Turnus's shoulder, was Pallas's sword belt, the trophy Turnus had taken when he killed Evander's son. The sight of it ignited something in Aeneas. All his rage at Pallas's death, all his grief for that young life cut short, all his fury at the war Turnus had forced on them. Everything came flooding back. "You think you can escape wearing the spoils of my people?" Aeneas's voice was cold with rage. "Pallas strikes this blow. Pallas takes this vengeance." He drove his sword into Turnus's chest. The Rutulian prince gasped once, and then his spirit fled, angry and resentful, down to the shades below. And there, the Aeneid ends. Abruptly, shockingly, with no triumph, no celebration, no wedding to Lavinia, no founding of the city, just Turnus's soul descending to the underworld and the final image of Aeneas standing over his enemy's corpse, consumed by rage and grief, having won his destiny at the cost of his mercy. Virgil never finished revising the poem. He died before he could write the conclusion he might have planned, before he could soften this brutal ending or explain what it meant. We're left with this moment of violence and moral ambiguity, this act that seems simultaneously just and wrong. Turnus fought against fate and lost. That was inevitable. But Aeneas was supposed to represent pietas, duty and mercy, and in the moment that mattered most, when he had the chance to show clementia, to spare the conquered as Anchises had instructed in the underworld, he chose vengeance instead. Was it right? Was it wrong? Virgil doesn't tell us. The poem simply ends, leaving that question hanging in the air, as uncomfortable and unresolved as the world Virgil himself lived in, where peace came at the price of civil war, where order was built on violence, where destiny demanded terrible sacrifices from everyone it touched. Themes, Roman values, and lasting legacy. The Aeneid is structured around a central tension between personal desire and civic duty, between human emotion and the demands of fate. At its heart is the concept of pietas, the defining Roman virtue that encompassed devotion to the gods, to family, and to the state. Aeneas embodies this ideal, but Virgil doesn't present it as simple or comfortable. Throughout the poem, pietas requires Aeneas to sacrifice personal happiness for his mission. He leaves burning Troy not because he wants to, but because the gods command it. He abandons Dido not because he's heartless, but because his duty to found Rome outweighs his feelings for her. He fights wars in Italy not from ambition, but because fate has decreed he must. Aeneas is pious Aeneas, dutiful Aeneas, and that epithet appears throughout the poem like a reminder of what he represents. But Virgil shows the cost of this devotion: Dido's suicide, Pallas's death, Turnus's plea for mercy. These moments reveal what empire-building demands. The glory of Rome is real in the poem, prophesied by Jupiter, shown to Aeneas in the underworld, depicted on his shield. But Virgil never lets us forget the suffering that made it possible. The Aeneid celebrates Rome's destiny while mourning those destroyed by it. Fate itself is one of the poem's great forces. Unlike in many Greek epics where heroes can sometimes bargain with or influence their destinies, fate in the Aeneid is absolute. What is fated will happen. Jupiter has decreed it. Aeneas will found the line that leads to Rome. No god, no mortal can prevent this. Juno delays it, but she cannot change it. Turnus fights it, but he cannot escape it. This absolute quality of fate reflected Roman beliefs about their own history. Romans saw themselves as a people chosen by destiny for greatness. Their empire wasn't just political success, it was cosmic necessity, willed by the gods, inscribed in the very fabric of reality. The Aeneid gave that belief its most powerful expression. When Augustus read Virgil's prophecies of Roman glory, he saw justification for his own rule, proof that the chaos of the civil wars had led inexorably to his principate. The poem also explores the role of divine intervention in human affairs. The gods are constantly manipulating events, pushing mortals toward or away from their fates. Venus helps her son, Aeneas. Juno opposes him. Jupiter maintains the overall plan. Neptune calms storms. Minor deities like Tiberinus and Juturna intervene in specific moments. The gods are everywhere, their presence unavoidable. But their interventions don't make mortals mere puppets. Aeneas still has to make choices, even if the ultimate outcome is fixed. He chooses to leave Dido. He chooses to go to war. He chooses to kill Turnus. The gods can influence these choices, can make some options easier or harder, but they can't eliminate human agency entirely. This balance between fate and free will, between divine plan and human choice, was central to Roman religious thought, and Virgil explores it throughout the epic. War and violence permeate the Aeneid. The second half especially is filled with battle scenes, death scenes, descriptions of wounds and suffering. Virgil inherited this from Homer, whose Iliad was similarly focused on warfare. But Virgil's treatment of war is notably darker than Homer's. Where Homer could celebrate martial glory, Virgil seems more ambivalent. Look at how he describes the young warriors who die. He names them, gives them backstories, tells us about their families. Nisus and Euryalus, lovers dying together. Pallas, whose father will never recover from his loss. Lausus, protecting his unworthy father. Camilla, who never got to marry or have a life beyond warfare. These aren't nameless casualties. They're people, and their deaths matter. The poem was written during Augustus's reign, after decades of civil war. Virgil and his generation had seen Romans killing Romans in massive numbers. The Aeneid reflects that trauma. War, even necessary war, even fated war, costs too much. Victory brings pain alongside triumph. Peace is always purchased with blood. This brings us to the question of propaganda. Augustus clearly wanted the Aeneid to glorify Rome and justify his rule. Virgil certainly provided that glorification. The prophecies of Roman greatness, the depiction of Augustus as the culmination of centuries of history, the connection of his family to Venus herself, all of this serves Augustus's political needs. But if the Aeneid is propaganda, it's the most complex propaganda ever written. Because Virgil also shows the suffering that empire causes. He makes Dido sympathetic, almost more sympathetic than Aeneas. He shows Turnus as brave and honorable, fighting for his homeland against foreign invaders. He ends the poem not with triumph, but with an act of rage-fueled violence that feels morally troubling. The poem celebrates Roman destiny while also questioning whether that destiny is worth its price. Scholars have debated for centuries whether Virgil believed in the Augustan vision or subtly subverted it. The truth is probably that he felt both things simultaneously. He'd lived through civil war. He knew peace was precious. If Augustus could maintain that peace, even at the cost of liberty, perhaps it was worth it. But Virgil also remembered what that peace had cost, how many died, how much was lost. The Aeneid reflects that ambivalence, that mixture of celebration and sorrow, hope and grief. The poem's influence on Western literature is almost impossible to overstate. It became the model for the literary epic. Dante made Virgil his guide through hell and purgatory in the Divine Comedy. Milton drew on the Aeneid heavily when writing Paradise Lost. Countless other poets, from the medieval period through the Renaissance and beyond, looked to Virgil as the supreme example of how to write great poetry. In the Roman world, the Aeneid was almost immediately canonical. By the 2nd century CE, educated Romans were expected to have memorized large portions of it. Schoolboys studied its grammar and rhetoric. Poets imitated its style. Commentators wrote volumes explaining its meanings. The poem shaped how Romans understood themselves, their history, their values, their place in the world. The story of Aeneas carrying his father out of burning Troy became an icon of filial piety, depicted in sculpture and painting throughout the Roman world. The image of Dido's suicide became synonymous with tragic love. The idea of Rome having Trojan origins became accepted fact, influencing everything from political propaganda to family genealogies. Later European kingdoms claimed descent from Trojan refugees, imitating the Aeneid's model. The French traced their origins to Francus, the British to Brutus, both supposedly descended from other Trojan survivors. These genealogies were fiction, but they showed the Aeneid's enduring influence, how it created a template for claiming ancient glorious origins. The poem also influenced ideas about leadership and duty. Aeneas became the model of the selfless leader who puts his people's needs above his own desires. This ideal of servant leadership, of personal sacrifice for the common good, shaped Western political thought for centuries. When later rulers wanted to present themselves as righteous leaders, they often compared themselves to Aeneas. The Aeneid's treatment of empire, of bringing civilization through conquest, of the burden of ruling others, influenced how European colonial powers justified their expansion. The British especially drew on Virgil's idea of bringing order and peace through domination. The line about sparing the conquered and warring down the proud became a motto for empire builders who conveniently forgot the suffering Virgil depicted alongside that imperial mission. In our own time, the Aeneid remains relevant because it grapples with questions that don't have easy answers. What do we owe to duty versus personal happiness? Is empire ever justified? Can violence in service of a greater good be moral? How do we honor both the victims and the victors of history? What does it mean to be caught between conflicting loyalties? The poem doesn't preach. It doesn't give us simple answers. It shows us Aeneas struggling with these questions, succeeding sometimes, failing sometimes, always bearing the weight of his mission. It shows us Dido destroyed by forces beyond her control. It shows us Turnus fighting bravely against impossible odds. It shows us hundreds of young men dying in wars they didn't start for causes they barely understood. And it leaves us with that final image, Aeneas standing over Turnus's body, having won everything and lost something crucial in the winning. The sword goes in, the soul departs. Rome's foundation is laid in blood and rage and grief. That's where Virgil ends his poem, at the moment of victory that doesn't feel like victory, of destiny fulfilled at the cost of mercy. Perhaps that's the most Roman thing about the Aeneid. Rome conquered the world. Rome brought centuries of relative peace and prosperity. Rome built roads and aqueducts and forums and temples. Rome created law and order across 3 continents. But Rome was also built on conquest, on subjugating other peoples, on endless wars and brutal suppressions. The glory and the horror were inseparable. Virgil understood this. He'd lived through the transition from republic to empire, seen the violence it required, benefited from the stability it brought. He wrote a poem that celebrates Roman greatness while never letting us forget what that greatness cost. That complexity, that refusal to simplify, is what makes the Aeneid more than propaganda, more than a national epic, more than a period piece. It remains a profound meditation on the price of civilization, the nature of duty, the meaning of heroism, in a world where the gods decree your path but don't make walking it easy. Aeneas carries his father out of Troy, carries his household gods across the Mediterranean, carries the weight of Rome's future on his shoulders. He does his duty, he fulfills his fate. But Virgil doesn't let us forget all those left behind, all those sacrificed, all those who paid for Rome's glory with their lives and loves and happiness. That's the story of the Aeneid. That's the founding of Rome. Not a simple tale of heroes and victories, but a complex, tragic, magnificent epic about what it costs to build an empire, about what we lose in the process of winning, about the terrible beauty of duty fulfilled. The poem ends with Turnus's death, but Rome's story was just beginning. From those Trojan refugees and Italian natives would come a people who would rule the Mediterranean world for 1,000 years. From Aeneas and Lavinia would come the line of Alban kings. From Romulus, Aeneas's distant descendant, would come the city itself. From Julius Caesar would come Augustus. From Augustus would come the Pax Romana, 2 centuries of relative peace and prosperity. All of that was written in Virgil's lines, prophesied by Jupiter, shown to Aeneas in the underworld, depicted on his shield. The glory of Rome was real. The cost of that glory was also real. Virgil honored both. He celebrated his nation's destiny while mourning those destroyed by it. He wrote propaganda for Augustus that was also a profound critique of the violence that made Augustus's peace possible. That's why the Aeneid endures. That's why we still read it, still study it, still argue about its meanings more than 2,000 years after Virgil died. Because it captures something true about civilization, about empire, about what we sacrifice when we build something meant to last forever. The sword goes into Turnus's chest. Rome rises from his blood. The victory is real, and the tragedy is real, and both will echo through the ages. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the Aeneid and the founding of Rome, please like and subscribe for more epic narratives from history, mythology, and literature. Let me know in the comments which other classical epics you'd like explored. Until next time, may your own journeys be less troubled than Aeneas's, and may you find peace at the end of your wandering.